Info. Welcome to How to Use on ONN's Funding Reform Research to Advocate in Times of Austerity. My name is Ebony Davitt. I am a policy advisor here at the Ontario Nonprofit Network, and my work primarily consists of working on funding reform, decent work, and anti-privatization. So before we get started, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping just so we kind of know where to ask questions and we know what's going on today. So first, if you are already a member of ONN, welcome back and thank you for your support. Our public policy research and advocacy work would not be possible without you. If you experience any technical difficulties today during the webinar, if you have any questions afterwards as well, first start with asking in the chat. Kavita will be more than happy to help you. And then my email will be attached in the chat as well if you have questions after the webinar. We encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A box throughout the session, and our team will be monitoring it throughout. You are also welcome to share comments and learnings on social media. To answer our most common question, you will receive a recording via email. It will include the slides and a link to resources. And like I said, it will include my email if you want to talk to me. Kavita is going to put some accessible versions of our slide for those with low vision in the chat right now. Okay, and just to ground us today, I want to start us off with a land acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge that we are meeting on unceded and unsurrendered land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from time immemorial. The ONN office is located on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. At ONN, we believe that as nonprofits, we must take seriously our role in responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. And before we move on to some more intros about ONN, I just want to say that a lot of the solutions that we're going to talk about today, about collective advocacy and ideas around reform, are in part influenced by Indigenous advocacy and Indigenous thinking. So I want to keep that in mind as we go through this presentation today. Let's jump in. So just a little about ONN. We are a provincial network for Ontario's 58,000 plus nonprofits and charity. We focus on policy, advocacy, and services to strengthen Ontario's nonprofit sector as a key pillar of our society and economy. Our goal is to connect, strengthen, and advocate with and for the nonprofit sector in Ontario, and it's research like this that we're going to talk about today that helps us do that. So just a little overview of the webinar before we jump in. So today I'm going to be sharing with you some data that I collected from talking to people throughout the sector around funding and funding issues that affect those with transfer payment agreements in Ontario. This research specifically looks at those with transfer payment agreements because that is a large portion of our membership. And that is who, as I'll speak to later, over 50% of our respondents in the sector survey receive funding from the provincial government. As part of this webinar today, we launched our funding reform advocacy briefs, which I'm sure we'll drop in the chat multiple times today. But if you want to take a look at those, I'll be speaking about them in depth more a little bit later. I also want to thank Atkinson Foundation, who without their funding, this work would not be possible. And finally, I want to thank the people I interviewed. I know a few of you signed up. I hope that you're here. If you're watching a recorded version, thank you. Thank you for sitting down with me and talking to me and taking the time to help me learn and have these stories to share with the rest of the sector. Okay, let's get started. So first and foremost, nonprofit sustainability is and has been since 2013 an ONN policy priority. This is an age-old problem that just needs new solutions. We understand the breadth, depth, and public benefit nature of our work necessitates we have financial stability with adequate investments that allow us to focus on our missions rather than on chasing money. We also understand that the constant changing economic, political, and social landscape is significantly and rapidly impacting nonprofit sustainability. We know that it's harder to do this work if you're an organization, as I said above, chasing money all the time, but it's also hard because it's a decent work issue, right? If you have HR problems, if you're constantly having to be, or you are being used as a training ground for your employees to maybe go work for the government or the school board, a place that pays a little bit more money than you receive in funding, it can mess with your ability to be sustainable as a nonprofit. And that also messes with your ability to do the work that we know you guys are so good at doing. So we know that nonprofit sustainability is directly connected to decent work. It's how we pay our workers the wages they deserve. It's how we give them the benefits they deserve. It's how we give them the pension funds and the appreciation that they deserve. So, as I said earlier, while approximately less than half of the sector receives provincial government funding, those that do receive provincial government funding receive a lot of money, and they play a major role in delivering care to communities across the sector, across Ontario, sorry. And this isn't the first time that we've gone into government relations around funding reform. So, as I said, we started this work in 2013. We started by joining the Joint Funding Reform Steering Committee with the Ontario government. After that, we transitioned to the Transfer Payment Administration Modernization Directorate in 2014, and we've continued to work with the government. But we also know that around COVID, things rapidly changed, right? We had to go through a crisis and work in a different way with government. And since COVID, we haven't really had the opportunity to get a lot of understanding or grasp on what's happening on the ground with the nonprofit sector when it comes to sustainability. So this is a look at our strategy when we wanted to learn more about what was going on with nonprofits on the ground. The last time we had collected data was around 2018. And so we knew that it was outdated when I started this work in 2024. And a lot of what we were hearing by doing our regional meetings, by meeting with our policy committee, our board, with our provincial associations, was that funding had fundamentally changed. The flexibility that was seen during COVID was no longer happening. Um, Organizations were, seeing more strict requirements around reporting. And so we just started trying to talk to more people. We started having conversations with people. We started calling up partners and saying, "What are you feeling about how transfer payment agreements are going? How are you seeing some positive things? Are there still some things that happened during COVID that were really helpful that remain, or has a lot of it been rolled back?" So we did jurisdictional scans too, right? We know that the rural perspective and the rural experience can be very different from that of the urban experience with funding, and there are a lot more opportunities for funding. So in major cities, so you might have a very different experience with how you're sustainable, how you're being sustainable or able to remain sustainable in an urban area compared to a place like Sudbury or Sault Ste. Marie. So, as I said, we went to a lot of regional meetings. We did our nonprofit driven on the road, where we went to places like Sudbury, we went to Timmins, we went to Thunder Bay, we went to Chatham Kent, Windsor. We went all over Ontario, and we heard that a lot of people were having similar problems with their transfer payment agreements. So we made the decision in 2024 to add a few questions to our State of the Sector survey, which we do every single year and have done every year since 2020. And we basically started asking people, do you receive provincial funding, right? What are some of the issues you're facing? How many ministries do you receive funding from? And we got a lot of that data back, and what we saw was that a lot of people had issues, right? And a lot of people were struggling with the changes that had come out of these newer iterations of the transfer payment agreements. So that was when we made the decision to do key informant interviews. And this was where we just made the decision to reach out to organizations from sports organization, arts, gender-based violence, Indigenous organizations, nonprofit housing orgs, and just sit with them for an hour and talk to them about what are you facing? What are you dealing with? What is the good, the bad, and the ugly? And I think, and I hope it was cathartic for all the people we spoke to because we got a lot of really good information. And I said to my boss, Pam, it was kind of like a record. Everyone was saying the same thing. It didn't matter that I was talking to someone who was dealing with coaches and, parents who want their kid to be better at the sport they're playing, or someone dealing with gender-based violence, or someone who's trying to acquire a building, right? They all had similar issues with transfer payment agreements. So, with this information, we identified a couple of opportunities for change that could help us build on the past work that we've done. And we saw two pathways, right? The traditional pathway and the one that makes the most logical sense was to ask for more money, right? Makes sense. It's what we need. We know we all need it. So we thought we can go to the government and we can say, we know there's an impending recession, right? We know a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. A lot of people may lose their homes. A lot of nonprofit services are going to have increasing wait lists and increasing need. So, how do we work together by you investing in us a little bit more to be able to help these communities? But that didn't really take, right? The government is dead set on austerity in some cases, like a deep recession like we are entering into now. And there's not much you can do, right? Everyone kind of has to pull the purse strings tight. So our second option was better money, right? We wanted to ask the government or start talking to the government about how can we make getting the money from you easier, right? How do we make the work easier? How do we deal with administrative burden, with lack of flexibility? How do we make it so that we can better work together as partners and better serve communities in the process? Another thing we wanted to do with this information was just to generally provide nonprofits with the data and stories that they need to talk about and to the provincial government about the issues they're facing. I think something I heard over and over again from people I was talking to was I go to the provincial government with an issue and I'm told that it's not something that they've heard from other people, or there's not really evidence that, this is a systemic issue. Therefore, it's not a priority for them. So, talking about better money was another way to gather together data and stories and say, this isn't just happening to me, it's happening to people who are receiving money within this ministry but aren't doing the same work as me, right? It's not just a me problem. And ultimately, the big goal, the major goal that I have, is to build and steward a funding reform coalition so that nonprofits can collectively advocate for not only better money, but eventually more money and for better wages in the end, right? That is the ultimate goal. I want us to be able to collaborate together alongside these provincial associations to make sure that we get eventually that more money that we know that we need. So here's a few things that we learned over the course of having these conversations and thinking about how we would do advocacy. So we knew that ideally we would need a champion in the provincial government, whether that was a bureaucrat or an MPP, right? We had heard that, going to a government official, an MPP, was probably not going to get us the results we wanted because a lot of the decision making and understanding in the nitty-gritty of the transfer payments agreements was happening with bureaucrats. So we knew that we would have to move away from looking for champions that are, MPPs and probably start looking into talking to bureaucrats more, right? We also knew that more money was going to be a harder and harder argument to make as the economic context got worse, right? As I said previously, as we get into austerity budgets, it's not really aligned with what the government is willing to do right now. And so we need to come up with a way, we need to pivot to find a way to get them to listen to us. So with better money, we saw that it aligned with an approach that the government has, which is red tape reduction and administrative reduction, right? We know that there is, and sometimes remains a perspective that there's a lot of bureaucracy, right? And that the government could do a better job at streamlining services. I know I've heard and read the lines streamlining services a million times at this point. And so we knew that better money was a way to kind of fit ourselves into what this government is willing to do. We also learned that negotiation as a tactic can be used by individual organizations, but it often results in minimal wins. We wrote a piece, or I wrote a piece last year about the domino effect. And this piece was basically about how, you can fund a single subsector, right? You can give a 2% increase to supportive housing. But if you have not properly invested into affordable housing, right? If we have not properly invested into employment and training, and a lot of other services that surround and are interconnected into that ecosystem, it matters, but it isn't going to make any deep and meaningful change because there's still that gap, right? And so what we kept seeing is organizations who had the money and the resources to hire maybe a GR firm or put a lot more effort into GR, capacity building and GR, government relations advocacy, that those were the organizations that were able to get the wins. They weren't the wins they necessarily wanted. They were usually small percentage increases, but that felt like a win. But what we also saw was that smaller organizations just couldn't keep up, right? If you can barely have the capacity to do the administration and reporting, it's going to be hard to build out an entire government relations campaign to convince the government that you deserve more money. So we saw that there was a difference in who was getting more money and that it wasn't actually resulting in any deep, deep change and the deep change that we know that we need. So let's talk a little bit about the data and what we got out of these conversations, right? So, like I said previously, in 2024, we decided to ask a few new questions, and our population for our survey is a little bit skewed because a lot of times we interact with social services. So we heard that 52% of respondents receive provincial government funding. Next, we heard that 46% of respondents claimed that they had issues with receiving less than 15% of funding administrative costs. We also heard that 41% that said that they had excessive or burdensome reporting requirements. And these two fit nicely together because if you have excessive or burdensome reporting requirements, you need the money, the administrative funds, to be able to complete this work, right? You have to have the resources to be able to give the government what they're asking. And if the government is not giving you enough, it gets harder and harder to meet those goalposts that they're setting for you. We also asked about what ministries do you receive funding from? And we listed all of the ministries, and we had people receiving funding from, the Ministry of Education, Ministry like Health. And that was a large percentage of people, all the way down to, I believe, forestry was in there, where we had a couple people receiving funding from there. So across the board, we had 22 different ministries that people were getting money from in some way, shape, or form. And not all of those ministries have, the same databases or the same reporting requirements. And so that can become a lot of work for people. And we wanted to dig a little deeper into that and understand what that actually was like on the ground. So, as I said, I spoke to a lot of different organizations of all different stripes across Ontario. And these first four bullet points are what we heard and the big themes that came to the surface. And these 4 points are what our four briefs that we published today are based off of. So the first one that came up, and this came up in every single interview, was that the provincial government lacks knowledge of Ontario's nonprofit sector. Now, I don't want to say this because I want you to assume that they just deliberately don't understand. I think it's a general misunderstanding across the board for people who use nonprofit services to those who work in nonprofit services to not always understand the nonprofit sector in general. I've used this example a couple of times with my coworkers. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, which has one of the biggest YMCA systems in North America. And my mom went to the gym there. I went to camp. I went to, after school care. It was a third space for school dances for us. And I never understood that it was a nonprofit because my mom paid a membership fee. She certainly paid for me to go to camp. And, NFL players went to work out there, right? I had no understanding that this was a place that could be a nonprofit because in my brain, a nonprofit doesn't make money, right? But it was only once I was older and I started working with the YMCA that I realized what was happening. And so I say all of this to say that you have a lot of people in the provincial government who engage with nonprofits readily, right? They fund them, they do and work alongside them. but they might not fully understand what it is they do and the breadth and depth of what they do. So, an example of this that I heard from the sports sector is they have so much fascinating data around health outcomes changing for kids who are in sports and how that impacts healthcare spending, right? It lowers the amount of healthcare spending the government needs to spend based on like the amount of children who are doing sports and have access to playing sports. And they have all this great data and they have an opportunity for the government, right? You can spend a little less on healthcare if you invest in sports and enable us to do better by our communities. But there's little understanding, right? Sports is kind of seen as something that, unfortunately is a privilege, right? If you have the money to put your kid into volleyball or swimming, great. If you don't, maybe you can sit on a wait list and hope that you can get them into a municipal program, right? But there's so much opportunity there, right? Outside of just playing a sport or having kids do sports that maybe the government doesn't see. Another great example we heard and that we use in the briefs is of the shelter system, right? For a lot of people, a shelter is a building with beds like on the ground. If you don't have a home, you come in, you get a bed, and you stay the night, and then you leave, right? A lot of the more intricate stuff that shelters and shelter frontline staff do around connecting people to counseling services, right? Connecting people to food banks or feeding people outright, getting them to employment and training centers. All of that harm reduction work that they do is vital to their work, right? But if the government understands them only, as we heard from some of our interviewees, as an entity that is a building in the middle of a city that has beds and they just function as a hotel clerk, they aren't going to understand how they are part of an ecosystem and how funding them does far more than just provide a bed to someone at one night a week or whenever they need it, right? So when we think about what we want to do about the government not understanding the nonprofit sector as well as they should, we see at the federal level that there has been some training, right? We see that there are ways to collaborate with bureaucrats and give and build closer relationships with them, right? We know that we're up against, the perspective that smaller government is what's best, right? That government previously has been very bloated. But we also know that if the government is going to cut staff, that the staff that they do leave should have a greater understanding of the nonprofits they're funding. So the second brief that we did and the second theme that came up a lot was transfer payment agreements lack flexibility. We saw during COVID, an immense amount of flexibility that enabled nonprofits who receive government money to pivot whenever they needed to, right? A crisis was a great way to test out flexibility and see that, it worked well. But unfortunately, a lot of that has been rolled back. And one of the things that we've heard from organizations is it's an onerous task to go back to your, program officer and say, look, we need to move, this budget line around. We need this to move. It takes a lot of time. It takes people away from the work, and it doesn't allow them to prioritize helping community. It, in fact, in some ways, wastes government time too, because you have organizations that have been receiving money from the government for, decades, right? We need to have some level of trust there that enables flexibility that allows these organizations to better do their work and better help their community. So the third theme is increasing administrative burden in transfer payment agreements. So what we have to think about when we think about this is a broader context, and a lot of nonprofits are kind of at the whim of things that, really have nothing to do with them. And one of the things that came up a couple times was some scandals that other charities had been through around government financing, right? And the public can sometimes have a reaction that is, we need to hold these organizations to account far more than we already do, right? And this has a trickle down effect where it results in more ideas about efficiency and quality control that result in more administrative burden, more data collection, right? And so organizations end up spending more time proving they're using the money right, as opposed to doing the work, right? One of the organizations I spoke to said it took them four staff out of, I believe it was 13, around 4 weeks to fill out all of their reporting requirements. And I don't think it's hard for us to say that a lot of that time could have been better spent helping their community, right? So, what we ask with the administrative burden is that we make databases, we streamline these databases, and we make them easier to use, more user friendly. You would be shocked at how many organizations, or at least I was shocked at how many organizations have volunteers doing their reporting requirements, right? Because they have to, they're volunteer run. And it's a lot to go to a 2 hour session and learn how to use a new database and then spend a few hours training your volunteers to use a database and spending so much time inputting this data. And not all of the data is used by the government. So, what we've asked in this brief is that we have transparency around what data is being used and we lessen the administrative requirements so that people can do more of the work and less of the reporting and spend less of their time reporting. We understand the value of reporting. We understand that that's necessary, right? But we want to make sure that everything we're reporting is necessary and relevant data to the government. For the third theme that came up, which was a surprise to us, we saw that there was increasing mergers amongst transfer payment recipients. We know that there is, and there can be within government and communities, a idea that there are too many nonprofits, right? We've heard from government the term duplication thrown around, that there's a lot of organizations doing the same exact work. But what we want to think about when we have this conversation is why, right? And fundamentally, this, too many nonprofits and duplication is a result of underfunding. I talked to numerous organizations who said, I'm funded to do this work, but I don't receive anywhere near enough funding to actually do it. So I leave a gap in my community because I'm not doing enough to deal with the problem. And so communities see that gap or they feel that gap and they come in and they try to fill it. And that creates a new nonprofit. And then suddenly there's competition for resources, and it becomes this, idea that, there's too many of you, why do you all exist? Without understanding the root cause of the problem, which is because not enough money has been invested into these sectors. And so what we've heard from government, or what we've heard from nonprofits, I should start with first, is that the government has a very general idea of there being too many nonprofits, and their solution is to do more mergers, right? And in some cases, to force organizations to merge. And this doesn't always end up with the result they would like because their main goal is to save money, right? But we know, we've done plenty of research at ONN, that you don't immediately reap cost savings from doing mergers. In fact, it ends up costing a lot of money. You have to fix your wages so that they align with each other, and that's often going up, right? There's costs to just doing a merger generally, like administrative costs. And it's not easy. I spoke to an organization that served communities with disabilities, and what they had faced was a merger previously that happened 5 years ago, I believe it was. But on the back end, in the reporting part of their work, they were still different organizations. So it wasn't even fully completed. They still had to spend individual time, which is money, doing reporting requirements and fulfilling these administrative pieces for the government as separate entities, despite having been merged, right? So what we're asking is that if you are going to do mergers, because we recognize that it's going to happen and some people want it to happen, make sure that you have the consent of these organizations. Make sure we understand why they exist. I think a good example of this is, women's health clinics in communities, right? There are health clinics that serve Black women specifically and reproductive issues that Black women might face or health issues they might face specifically. And maybe it's not the best idea to have that folded into a general women's health organization. But if there's another general health women's organization and they have enough in common and they're willing and they're ready, maybe it makes sense to merge them. And so what we want is to move away from doing mergers and forcing mergers on the sector as a means of gaining cost savings for the government and move towards doing mergers with the consent of organizations that are ready and willing, but also with the goal of streamlining services and better serving those communities. So I want to talk really quickly about some of the emerging trends that we saw, because these were really interesting to me. We didn't do any briefs on these. This is definitely some data we'll use in other places, but these came up a few times for some people, including the first one, they didn't come up at all, but they're super interesting to think about. So the first one is increased use of risk assessment matrices. So we heard from some people that they were around previously, they went away, and they're coming back. And basically, these are assessments that look at how risky you are as an organization to fund. And like I said, some organizations that I asked said, never heard of it. I've never had any interaction with it. Some that I talked to said, wait till you hear what I have to say about all of this. Right? So it's different across the board. I talked to an organization that said that they filled out this assessment for one ministry, MCCSS, and they were deemed low risk. And then they did it for another ministry and they were deemed high risk. And that changed the amount of money they would receive or flexibility or leeway, whatever it may be, because the government or that ministry had deemed them risky or not risky. But the problem with this is that we don't know what exactly is being assessed. We don't know what is being graded, right? And so what we've talked a little bit about, because we don't have a full-blown solution for this yet, is more transparency, right? Just let us know what is the risk assessment matrix. Let us know, what's going on, what people are being graded on, and why one ministry may have standards that are different than another. We've also seen a change towards funding big box nonprofits versus smaller organizations, and generally a more one size fits all approach to transfer payment agreements. So, one of the organizations I spoke to, I believe they employed maybe around 10 people. And they said that they were seeing more and more transfer payment agreements that seemed to be better suited for a much bigger nonprofit that was receiving millions of dollars a year versus them who were receiving thousands, right? And as I mentioned before, with an admin burden and spending a lot of time, that in part stems from this, right? If there is a belief that putting a one size fits all transfer payment agreement out there is the best option or the easiest option for government, what we're hearing is it doesn't actually work for all nonprofits. It's harder for a smaller nonprofit who isn't receiving as much money to do a ton of data collection and do a ton of administrative work because when they're receiving such little money, right? It doesn't really make sense. And it would actually be easier to make agreements for those who are smaller in a specific size that are different than those who are receiving millions and millions of dollars a year, right? And so we want to think a little bit more about how we make sure that it's easier for people to do the work. Not everyone has designated staff that is paid very nice wages to do just reporting requirements and applying for funding, right? There are lots of organizations I spoke to that said, no, we have staff that do that. And then there's other organizations I spoke to that said, no, we have to use our own staff to do that work, and it takes time away from our community. So similar to increase in administrative burden there, but a more specific problem that's being seen. The last piece, and this is interesting to me because as I said in the beginning, I'm doing a lot of anti-privatization work, is we're seeing increases in privatization in the sector. And this comes in a lot of different forms, right? So we have heard from organizations like AIDS organizations that used to do used needle pickups and disposal. Their contracts were then handed over to private, disposal companies. Then we're also seeing, as I'm sure many of you know, healthcare privatization, right? Where surgeries that used to be performed in nonprofit or public hospitals are now being performed by, private entities. And we're seeing a lot of this come through in the form of transformation. So the best example of this would be employment and training. The employment and training, as some of you may know, went through transformation a few years ago. And basically the goal of this was to streamline services, to better serve those on OW with ODSP, and to make sure that people were being properly given or connected to the jobs that they needed. Unfortunately, during that process, and we wrote a paper on this, and maybe our comms team can drop it in the chat, was that a lot of the consultation around employment and training was done with bigger box, either nonprofits, but mostly, private for-profit entities. And so the system was built to serve their needs being to provide shareholder dividends, and not the needs of a small, storefront or organization in Chatham, Kent, right? Or in Peel region. And so what ended up happening, and what I'm sure a lot of you have seen, is that the new system just doesn't really work for a lot of nonprofits. They can't keep up with the performance quotas that they're required to. A lot of people with disabilities are not being served properly. We know youth are definitely not being served properly. And it's causing a lot of issues to the point that we're seeing a lot of historic organizations that do employment and training work putting out emails. We put one of these in our newsletter recently from ONN, which basically says, we can't do this anymore. We're not doing employment and training services anymore, right? And so privatization is an issue. We're doing a lot of separate work on this ourselves, but it's an issue that's coming up for people because oftentimes, with the goal of transforming a subsector and making it better for people, we can actually end up with making it worse by introducing actors that don't really have a vested interest in care. They have more of an interest in extracting money from the system. So the last trend, I'm sure this won't surprise any of you, is of course lack of funding. And I want to just say this out loud partially because, it's hard to ignore that a lot of these problems are a byproduct of just lack of funding, right? And a lot of people's issues stem from the fact that, if they just had a 2% increase, they could serve significantly more people. And they would be able to hire a few more staff members. They would be able to give their staff the raises they need to keep them around and not be dealing with a constant HR crisis. And so I would be remiss if I didn't mention and say outright that funding, lack of money from the government is still a huge, huge problem. So this is where I try to sell you something. And this is where we talk about collective advocacy. So changing times call for social movements to adopt new strategies. And I want to talk a little bit about André Gortz, who was an Austrian-French social philosopher. So in 1964, he wrote a book called Strategy for Labor, where he coined the term non-reformist reforms. This was the idea that social movements could both make immediate gains and build strength for a wider struggle, eventually culminating in revolutionary change. A certain type of reform, in other words, could herald greater transformations to come. He stated, now more than ever, it is necessary to present not only an overall alternative, but also those intermediate objectives which lead to those alternatives and foreshadow them in the present. Transformation, he said, would come about through long-term and conscious action, which starts with the gradual application of a coherent program of reforms, something he termed trials of strength. Small wins could allow movements to build power and to put them on more favorable footing for the future. So I want to say that we have talked to a lot of our partners about collective advocacy before. This isn't the first time that we've brought it up. And a lot of what we heard is that we just need more money. We don't want to advocate for these smaller things because we know that the root cause of these issues is more money. But now we're facing a context where more money might not be an option, but we still need to try. And we still need to find ways to transform and build out and strengthen the sector, even during times of crisis, because times of crisis truly can be opportunities for change. So here at ONN, our first transformation starts with this new government funding coalition that we're building, right? It starts with you guys joining us in trying to do this work and do this advocacy. And our non-reformist reform is this better money advocacy. This can be that transitional step that can help us illuminate the path to the alternative, the more money, the more revolutionary, systemic funding that we truly want. You all know better than anyone that if nonprofits have more time to do their work, if they work alongside governments that understand their work, and if they have more flexibility with budgets, families, communities, and Ontarians generally receive the better and higher quality services that they need and deserve. These non-reformist reforms, these seemingly small steps, right, that often seem, to not matter, and they seem like things we can deal with later, we can put up with now, they could be that critical piece to getting us closer to the more money collective goal that we have. So I'll get off my high horse and I'll come down and I'll say that advocacy for better money can repurpose the province's red tape reduction, efficiency, and effectiveness agenda. We know that this is something the government is already thinking about. So that is an opportunity for us to think about. We know that these four themes are longstanding issues that are often set aside in favor of fighting for more funding. But when more funding isn't on the table, what do we start thinking about? And we know that collective advocacy on these issues can help guide us towards the more money reality the sector truly needs. We know that these steps can get us there, right? If we have the time and space to do the work better, if we have the time and opportunity to be more flexible and do it faster, if we have and work alongside governments that understand us, right? How is that a step towards getting us to the more money we truly need? So that's where I want to leave you and start hoping that it starts marinating in your brain or thinking about how you can play a role in collectively doing advocacy alongside us and building out this opportunity. So I hope that a lot of what I said validates what you're feeling, and I hope that you feel less alone. I think that's what I felt from a lot of people I talked with. I have this slide here so that when you guys receive the slide deck, you'll have all the resources, including a sign-up form to become part of our coalition. And next, I want to hand it off to our two speakers. I've asked them to be here today to talk about their experiences doing collective advocacy. So you can hear about what's happening in other provinces, at other levels of government, and kind of get an idea of what it could possibly look like. So first, I want to start with Amy Mullis. She's the Executive Director of the Federation of Community and Social Services of British Columbia. And Amy's going to talk to us about the collective advocacy work that they've been doing on behalf of the social services sector in BC. Oh, you're muted.
My bad.
There you
My
go.
apologies. Thank you. I am calling in today from the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and I'm so grateful for their stewardship of these lands. Grateful to live here, have my children play and go to school here. The work of the Federation takes place across the province of British Columbia, and the Federation and its members are very grateful for the opportunity to work across lands of Indigenous communities and First Nations territories in what is now known as British Columbia. So, as Ebony shared, I am the executive director of the Federation. The Federation is about 170 social service agencies that provide support to individuals and communities across British Columbia. Our agencies offer a broad range of services, including staffed residential care, supported child development, child care, family preservation, harm reduction, youth mental health, services that support seniors, domestic violence intervention, services for adults with developmental disability, services for people with autism, and much, much more. We are about 40 years old, and I will argue that collective advocacy, collaborative advocacy is part of the lifeblood of the Federation. It's the reason we're formed, and we've carried that through our mandate. And I picked that up when I joined the Federation about 2 years ago. And one of the reasons I was really excited to join the Federation is to kind of move that those pieces forward in a collective and thoughtful way. So in BC, programs like what I just shared with you are funded. It sounds very similar then to what's going on in Ontario. So multiple different ministries, crown corporations, as well as some federal dollars, as well as a number of organizations do their own fundraising. There's grants, there's other pieces that bring in the funds to support the work. The big theme for our members and the sector as a whole is that lack of funding generally. And so I'll touch on that a little bit more, but finding other ways to support the work, the really important work, is definitely something that the Federation is also part of our main collective advocacy approach. I think when you have multiple funders and when you are supporting a variety of people, in some cases, our province's most vulnerable people, communication, coordination, and collaboration in that advocacy are absolutely necessary to ensure effective service, efficient service, and that policies and processes reflect the realities of the work. So that's where the Federation really does step in and lead. Um, Going back to the lifeblood of who we are, we realize pretty quickly, and this is how we describe it, that those who are carrying the services, those who are supporting the work, are the experts on the ground. The government, as mentioned, MPs come and go, MLAs come and go. It tends to be people on the ground who really understand what's going on in their communities and the needs of their communities. And so figuring out how to, you know, disrupt the powers, just the power struggle there a little bit. It's not top down, it's not government down, it's actually community up. And that's one of the pieces that we bring forward to this work. I think the other piece here is just the complexity of the work. So you're dealing with people who, at the center of the work, children and families in many instances, are working and navigating multiple systems. And so to help ensure that those systems can talk to each other, that they can create better outcomes for those people who are at the center of the work. These are all kind of threads into this collective advocacy that makes up the Federation. And so we've been quite successful in a number of ways to bring collective advocacies and specific pieces of that forward. And I think this is an opportunity for us to share a little bit about some of those examples. And I think one in particular is going to sort of resonate with the plans that Ebony has shared around this particular working group or table they're bringing together. Could you, next slide, please? So I think no matter the organization, and we have big organizations, we have small organizations, there's for-profit, nonprofit, union, non-union, rural, urban, multiple funders, single funders. We can all benefit from improving the system. And so when you become a member of the Federation, and again, this goes to that lifeblood, there's sort of an understanding that you're doing it for yourself and your organization and supporting the work, but you're also becoming part of a collective. And so we advocate on behalf of the members, but also speak for the sector. And then, you really have a bit of a value system that's aligned with this stronger voice altogether piece that the Federation brings. I think there's also a recognition that there's a complexity in these issues. So it's the complexity in who you're serving is, and we've got some incredible leaders in the field who've been working in this sector for a very long time, who often share that who is walking in those doors, who's using those services, there's a complexity that they have never seen before. So if you're thinking of a child who enters staff residential, 30 years ago, they weren't safe in their home. And now they're coming in and they may have had firsthand experience of toxic drug issues. They may have seen death. There may be some violence in that they've seen. They may be gang activity. They may be youth mental health. They may have not received the earlier support they needed for speech language or reading. So, and now they've entered this system where it's now they have a roof over their head that's safe, and they may be getting food and other supports that way, but they have a myriad of other um, pieces that's influenced their life and who they are, and they need to be supported in those other sort of spheres or sectors as well. So this is what we're dealing with. I think the other piece within this complexity that we don't mention is when we make adjustments to these systems, um, interventions from the government, an adjustment to a contract language, an alteration to a policy, there are unintended consequences to that that can ripple out in a myriad of ways. And so the other side of the Federation here is saying, with these experts on the ground, why don't you bring them to the table, talk about what your plans are for that change, and let's see what they can suggest as like alternatives or changes that make sense on the ground that will help alleviate some of those unintended consequences. I would argue this is not always easy. It's not fast in many instances, but a unified, strong voice is harder to dismiss. And I think this goes to what Ebony shared about teaching people, training people with on the government side about the work, about the people you're supporting, about the fabric of the community, about the economic impact of the work that's being done, and a really powerful way of showcasing nonprofits and community social services in a really important way. So some of these initiatives you can see on the slide here, I will share a bit more about. I think the big one is the Community Social Services Roundtable. So as Ebony noted in her conversation, finding those champions is really, really important. And this roundtable is a bit of an ecosystem on the government side. And these are the champions. So in about 2018, so this was before COVID, this group came together under the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction in British Columbia, with the idea that, wait a minute, there's a lot going on in this sector, there's a lot going on the nonprofit side. How can we make sure that the government folk understand what's going on, and that any changes or ideas or implementation that comes down through this new government, because this was a time when the NDP had come in after a very long tenure by the Liberal government, to help make changes within the community social services. And it is a definite ecosystem. The reference group noted there is a group of provincial organizations that do come together regularly to try and figure out what are those big buckets of work. This is where we loop back to some of these administration funding pieces that Ebony shared. We have a similar big bucket, if you will. We talk about technology needs for the sector as a whole instead of sort of individual pieces. We talk about contract reform. So again, trying to alleviate some of that administration burden. And we talk a lot about wages and equity across the sector. So this is the opportunity for us as a sector to figure out what our key messages are, what our big buckets are, and present those to the government instead of having these like smaller groups or little tables to come together. Because this was set up from a government side, there's no lobbying rules in the same way, shape, or form. And they've actually allocated government ministry time to assist with this work. So moving down to the contracting committee, this is led by some key members across a couple of different ministries who then bring together a few of these different working tables. So of those big buckets the reference group has mentioned, okay, let's start slicing that off and really look at what it is. So I mentioned technology earlier. This is, as you most likely know on this call, technology, software, hardware, insurance for cybersecurity, those pieces kind of get lumped together and are often neglected or ignored because of cost, because of capacity. So when we put that forward in a big bucket, the contracting committee kind of slices it off. And one of the working tables right now is a cybersecurity working group. So what do we mean by cybersecurity? what does the government need to know about cybersecurity and insurance? Where are the pinch points when it comes to cybersecurity? And then starting to look at different ways we can support and make recommendations to improve this big bucket or some of the pieces within that. We recognize that we're not going to solve all of the problems within these big buckets, but it's a really great way to sort of slice off and bring forward some of those more pressing issues and sort of, again, really train up some of the on the ground issues and what's making what some of the some of the ways that we can really improve the work and make it more efficient. So that better money scenario that Ebony is speaking to. The second piece there is training funds. So within the sector itself, we have been really successful in recognizing and illustrating that training is needed. Funds are needed for that. I think the government itself has been able to sort of put forth and earmark certain amounts of money to support training for the community social services sector. And so we've seen some real progress in some of the training offerings and some of the pieces that we can bring, ways that we can ensure recruitment and retention is kept in place, that people are doing the jobs that they should be doing, taking some of that financial burden off the organizations themselves to make sure that people are supported and trained up to support some really complex work and some complex issues. And then I think the other last one that I'd love to share here is just, and this is fairly recent, under the $10 a day funding model. We have had some success in bringing forward some changes to that funding model. So in BC, they initiated a particular model to start that program, to initiate that program a few years ago. That model worked very well. And then under austerity measures, or in preparation for austerity, I would argue, they changed that model a little bit. And again, these are those unintended consequences. I think what looks good on paper, um, you know, didn't translate into reality. I think the other piece that big takeaway from this particular collaborative advocacy work was, again, we're not dealing with reams of paper or nuts and bolts. We're dealing with people. So every childcare center has to be looked at differently because they have different needs. They support different clients, different children. And so the changes that they were made didn't reflect that. So there was a real recognition just recently that, okay, this is not working. Okay, what are we going to do next? And so the government has come together, the Ministry of Education and Childcare has come together to and recognize this and said this out loud, which is great. They've budgeted some additional funds in our latest provincial budget, which is another key recommendation and recognition of the work. And so now the work begins of like, okay, we've got the experts on the ground again. What are the changes that we can make that make sense for this funding agreement, that makes sense for a larger urban center, childcare center, and a smaller rural center? When we talk about quality care versus just childcare more generally, what does that look like, and how is that reflected in funding and contract pieces? So I wanted to share some wins here because it is possible. I think the other sort of tidbit that I do want to share is that it's not always easy to get these things going. And so I think when we are talking about collaborative advocacy in times of austerity, I think you need to be really specific in what you're trying to tackle. Um, I totally agree with you, Ebony. Finding those champions and figuring out how you're going to connect in and train is key. And so in BC, we have been quite lucky to have this as part of our history and like sort of the lifeblood of not just the Federation, but organizations across the whole. We've also seen a number of folks who maybe started on the community social services and transitioned into ministry or into government. And so utilizing in our relationships to remind them of what it was like when they worked on the ground. We've actually seen the other side too, where they've had, government deputy ministers, assistant deputy ministers who've moved into social services. And so leveraging their knowledge and information and insight about government to kind of help us formulate a really strong collective voice and a really, really strong table and place that we can be thoughtful with the work. I think the other sort of life lesson is this, is that we can't do it all. And I think that's where we need to just, again, be really thoughtful with capacity, where we need to be um, with uh, with like those big buckets within this pieces of work. You kind of have to park some of your individualism. You have to be, kind of come at this with a values piece of like, we are a united voice, we're a collective voice. We need to come together, and I might not get what I specifically need from my organization, but I'm going to join this call. I'm going to be on this table. I'm going to share out this information because collectively we will move the dial. And I think it this is sometimes difficult for people to get over and see that sort of value in that. But once you do, then you have a really strong group of folk who are moving some of the dial forward. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I really loved the collective voice is harder to ignore because I think that's something that we really want to get across. It's almost like a union, right? We know and we felt when we were doing these interviews, everyone has a lot of the same issues. So let's continue to
Exactly.
collaborate. Yeah. Thank
And
you.
preparing for I think the other piece here, just to share that
Mhm.
we are in times of austerity, but that
Yeah.
pendulum swings off, we're waiting for the pendulum. So how
Yeah.
we've approached this through the reference group is also, okay, what work can we do now, knowing that pendulum will swing the other
Yeah.
direction? It may be next year, it may be in 5 years, but what can we start undertaking?
Mhm.
Because again, this is having that group of people who've been in the sector for a while and understand how this kind of this work kind of lives and breathes and evolves. And
Mhm.
so I think that has also been really helpful when messaging for the government side, when okay, we don't need to give them more money now. It's
Yeah.
worthy of the conversation because they recognize that this is not the time for new money. Let's move this forward in
Mhm.
a different way.
Yeah, for sure. That reminds me of another example out of BC. We've been doing a lot of housing work, and we talked to people in BC about the rental protection fund over there, and they told us a similar thing, right? They knew under the Liberal government it probably wasn't going to happen, so they just collectively advocated to what they assumed would be the next government, the NDP. They were right. And when the government came in, they were like, we're knowledgeable about this. We know how it works. We know how to do it. So we're going to collaborate with you to get this done. But it was a long process of basically finding those champions in what was an opposition party and waiting for them to eventually become uh, the majority. And it worked, right? You have a lot of affordable housing, well, not a lot, but some affordable housing in BC because of this. That's
We've
great.
been
Thank you
really
so much.
successful in some of
Yeah,
that for sure, for
yeah.
sure.
Thank you so much, Amy. Next, I'm going to welcome Shannon Kindorney, the Deputy CEO of Cooperation Canada. Shannon is a member of Imagine Canada's Fair Funding Coalition Steering Committee, and in both roles, Shannon has participated in collective advocacy, and today she's going to share more about those experiences with us. Welcome, Shannon.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So for those of you that don't know my organization, Cooperation Canada represents the international development and humanitarian sector. So that's sort of all across the country. And our sort of key interlocutor would be kind of Global Affairs Canada, as well as the Canadian Revenue Agency, Finance, and Treasury, sometimes depending on what we're advocating for. And as Ebony said, I'm part of the Fair Funding for Nonprofits steering committee. I'm also on their advocacy committee as well. And I'm just really grateful to be a part of this conversation today. I think we've heard enough about kind of the moment we're in and the importance of collective work. So I'm happy if you want to go to the next slide, Ebony, and I'll share a bit more just about the kind of the Fair Funding for Nonprofits group. So it was recently launched. It was the end of last year. We kind of formally had a public launch of the Fair Funding for Nonprofits group, but it's essentially a coalition that's working to enable more equitable and effective federal funding for nonprofits. So this is across the board, whether similar to kind of the research that Ebony has been leading. The coalition's focus is more generally on how the federal government funds nonprofits, regardless of what community you focus on, and what kind of cause you're trying to improve or make better in the world. The steering committee itself is quite diverse. So we have provincial associations and nonprofit networks. There's folks representing youth employment, homelessness, immigration, refugee serving, environment, arts and culture, and so on. So it is a very, very diverse coalition that sits around the table of both steering the steering committee of this coalition, but then across the various sort of subcommittees that the coalition has. And I think that range of organizations really does matter. Um, because one of the things that we discovered early on is that it didn't really matter what the nature of your work was, the funding barriers you were encountering were remarkably similar, and they very much mimic those that Ebony presented earlier at the federal level. Um, Really, this is around issues like, the data that's being collected or the forms that we submit, the timelines, the reporting, the rules around flexibility, but also the other broader issues that I think you've named, Ebony, around kind of wages, around equitable employment, training, all these other kinds of pieces squarely are issues also in the federal government level. Imagine Canada serves as the backbone organization for the coalition, and provides support to kind of ensure the work moves ahead. Next slide. So, in terms of the challenges, maybe just to share a bit more. So, obviously, the heavy administrative burden piece is a key one. So, this is, both for grants and contributions that are received at the federal level. They're complicated, they're duplicative, they're inefficient. Often, you're repeating the same information to multiple government departments, which many will be familiar with. Your reporting time can be really, really burdensome for very low amounts of money. And so, one of the kind of pieces we're trying to do to address that is actually moving to more of a one partner, one profile approach. So, could not all the departments have the same form or the same information being collected? Ideally, could we just have one thing we input, and then when we apply for different funding, they have access to it? The second issue is around the short-term nature of funding agreements or them being too slow. So anyone that's applied, there's both the issue of the funding cycles being 1 year or 2 years, which is very difficult to get something up and going, implement, and then close and report, but also the gaps between funding and then sometimes long approvals. So the department I work with the most, Global Affairs Canada, it can be 18 months from submission of a concept to an approved project, just as an example. So obviously we know what that does to our organizations. It's a huge strain. It means staff turnover, it means disruption of services and so on. The funding itself, similar to what you found, Ebony, it's quite rigid. So this is around the question of how much can you move between funding lines. And then I think one of the pieces, I'll talk to this a bit more later, but working across the coalition with so many diverse organizations, there was a bit of, it was quite interesting to see that the rules are not equally applied. So that means within government departments and across government departments. So whereas Global Affairs Canada would allow you to transfer up to 40% of between budget lines for flow-through budgets, so not staff salaries, but for everything else. Other departments won't allow that. So just really seeing that kind of disparities across the departments themselves. And then finally, just the accountability pieces. So it's not necessarily right-sized. It was alluded to earlier, a $1 million project might have the same reporting requirements as a $100,000 project. And that, of course, doesn't make sense in terms of how you look at accountability and ensuring it's right-sized for the level of risk and for what you're trying to achieve in your timelines. You can go to the next slide. So just a bit about kind of why this coalition ended up being formed, why we're doing this work collectively. I mean, similar to what you've heard today, the challenges are consistent across the not-for-profit sector. We did find and have kind of showcased and developed examples and evidence all across different subsectors of nonprofits, and having those sort of aha moments where we realize, that one organization or one department would be carrying out their policies in one way, whereas another would be doing it in an entirely different and more restrictive way. And I would say for me, one of the sort of side benefits of this work has actually been that I've been able to then have stronger advocacy towards Global Affairs Canada as a coalition that works in that space, where I can draw those examples from other spaces in the same way that a coalition that maybe works around women's advancing women's rights could have a similar kind of conversation with Wage around how they're providing funding. So some benefits there for sure. I think to the point earlier that was already raised, but it's just around kind of the multiple voices get noticed. So, when one org raises an issue, it can be seen as isolated. So I can't understress the value of having hundreds of organizations kind of saying, no, this is a problem for us too, and helping the government to start see the structural kind of challenges and barriers. Um, the third point I would raise around kind of this work is the collective brain power. We have different organizations that all have different relationships, different policy instincts, evidence, and practical experiences. And that does make for sharper analysis. It makes for better advocacy. And to the point about kind of getting champions, it also means then that through working in the coalition, the pool of potential champions to improve or address the issue grows exponentially. So I bring my relationships with global affairs, I hold that relationship, I bring that to the coalition the same way someone in arts brings their relationship with Heritage Canada. And so we've been able to kind of leverage those relationships to start building kind of momentum across different government departments. Um, and then finally, I think is about community. I don't think it's incidental that coalitions do build community. And we're in times of uncertainty, connection actually does matter. Community makes organizations more resilient. It helps us to resist the silos that weaken us as a sector. And frankly, there is something powerful about remembering that regardless of the subsector or the issue area we work in, most of us are doing this work because we actually believe a better world is possible. And it's sort of, the kind of often cited sort of African proverb, but you can go faster alone, but you can go further together. Often when we work with our Indigenous partners, they say you need to go slow to go fast. And so there is, yeah, that to, Amy's point, the messiness or it takes patience, but you can go a lot further and sometimes even faster by building those relationships and that community. Some of the wins, mine are different, actually. Amy and I didn't necessarily kind of coordinate on the wins we were going to share. So I think on the next slide, I have some of the wins listed there. So I'm giving you kind of different levels of wins. So one was around this one partner, one profile. That would have been the most ideal solution for us in terms of how the federal government was funding. However, when we started doing the engagement and outreach, and that was including with folks that I would say are champions, are ready to make change, ready to work with us, they explained to us why that wasn't possible. And it's to do with federal privacy laws and rules and regulations that I don't think any government was going to be ready to actually tackle. So, but at the same time, everyone recognizes, okay, but submitting the same information in 50 different forms doesn't also make sense to all these departments. And so through that engagement, we're working on a pivot where actually what we're going to be asking for is kind of a data capsule approach, which is essentially saying, look, we get that you can't share information between government departments because of privacy or other kind of reasons. However, could you at least ensure that the forms are the same so that we have one form that we submit, each time or one way of sharing that information that's consistent across the departments, and that would actually reduce effort significantly. And so that's one we're exploring, and we've got champions that are sitting around Treasury Board table that are excited about it, and we'll see if it lands. But I mean, just that to me is a win. It's a win to pivot, to refine, and to find another kind of path through the difficulty of achieving your advocacy wins. The second one wasn't done with the fair funding for nonprofits as a full group. It was actually a subset that had built relationships and started working together. But this was really around the postal strike. So many of you may recall when the postal strike happened last year before, there was year-end giving. Huge impact. So I had members reaching out to us going, what are we going to do? Like most of our year-end giving is by mail. huge challenge. One of the sector health coalitions, same issue. And so then working with Imagine, the three of us essentially came together. We had op-eds, we reached out to the CRA, and we actually were able to demonstrate that the government had made provisions in the past to enable a longer giving period. And they made the change. So that was one of the most concrete and real world moments where working in coalition really did lead to a positive impact for our members, and we did it very, very quickly. It was done within 3 weeks, kind of thing. And the final one is really around my work with Cooperation Canada. Ebony was talking about administrative costs. Global Affairs Canada was putting in a new overhead compensation policy, which was essentially covering those administrative costs. And they didn't engage the sector quickly enough or sufficiently. And they were ready to go ahead with a policy that was really unclear whether it would both be favorable and equitable for the partners. So we rallied super quickly. We organized a feedback session, consultation. There was strong pushback, and it actually led to agreement to delay the policy by the department, as well as to then revisit the content and have a more effective consultation with the sector. And so that was a real kind of experience where we were able to kind of change the government's direction positively for the sector. Then finally, next slide on some of the wins or lessons learned. I alluded to this earlier, but like you don't know what you don't know. And so one of the biggest benefits of coalition work is what you learn by engaging across the subsectors, across different parts of government, and learning about better practices, learning what one organization got that was an exception, and then making the case for why it should be the rule. X works over here, why can't it work over there? And that's really powerful. The second is around engaging and then trusting the backbone. So the reality is most organizations do not have time to lead coalition work off the front of their desk. It's on the side of the desk. It's squeezed between many other priorities. So when you have a backbone organization, that work is so critical to moving coalition work ahead. It needs to be informed by the members. Folks need to have the space and capacity to engage. But the reality is coalition work is a choose your own adventure. At the lowest level, it can mean just staying informed. Maybe sometimes you sign on to a petition because that makes sense. It could also mean joining, like I have chosen to do, the advocacy and steering committee of this coalition and being a part of the governance and strategy. And there's a lot of in between. So, like, not everyone can do everything all the time, and that's okay. I think it's really just maybe informing the direction and then being prepared to kind of those that have the space and capacity, the backbone to keep it moving forward, trusting them to kind of do that and move things ahead. The third is around the resilience in uncertain times. So this was alluded to earlier, Amy, as well, and kind of the advocacy that had been done in BC. But the reality is, building those community and relationships now makes you stronger later. Governments change, ministers change, public servants move, priorities shift. So if you have a collective base, you've got a shared language, you've got the trusted relationships in place, it makes it so much easier to respond and re-engage. And the final thing is really around solidarity. Solidarity matters. Resisting silos is in and of itself an act of solidarity. Community and connection are acts of resistance at a time when political dynamics reward division. So coalition work, I think, really reminds us that our issues are interconnected, but more importantly, that we are interconnected and that our strength often comes from refusing to let division and narrow self-interest divide us or define us. So final slide, maybe just a final kind of takeaway. If you're thinking about collective advocacy at the provincial level, don't underestimate what can come from building a broad table, investing in the relationships, being willing to learn your way towards stronger asks. Coalitions are not always fast, they're messy, they require trust and patience, but I think they do make us stronger and more resilient. And I think in this moment we're in, that really matters. My final plug is that this coalition, the Fair Funding for Nonprofits, is actually having an event in May. So if you are based in Ottawa, there is a reception, and I'm happy to plop that in the chat. And we also have a pre-budget submission if folks are interested in engaging on that as well. It's a call out for sign on. So if that's relevant to you, please join us. Yeah, I'll end with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. And I will be seeing you in Ottawa. One of the things that you said that stood out to me is that coalitions, they don't begin and end with the work you set out to do. There's so many other opportunities within these coalitions that you can, build networks out of. I think one of the amazing things to see at ONN is we go around the province, as I said, to meet with people and being able to connect people who are having similar experiences in a myriad of different ways and be able to be like, they experienced that a couple years ago, talk to them, and then those relationships growing out of that. It's a really fascinating and amazing thing to see. So I'm going to stop sharing. And because we don't have a ton of time left and I'd love to hear from people, I'm only going to ask you guys one question and then we can look into the chat. But I'm wondering, how has participating in collective advocacy changed your outlook on your work?
You want me to jump in, Shannon?
Sure.
Um, I actually would argue it hasn't really, if that makes sense. I
Mhm.
sort of fell into this work, I will be really honest. I ended up at an early years research institute when I left university, and it was a job. I was excited, but
Mhm.
it was there that I realized, oh, wait a minute, there's all of these community people who are doing this incredible work. Um, Supporting children and families with almost nothing, and really connecting with each other to do it, recognizing the social determinants are so important and the early years are important, and trying to build the best life for the children and within all those communities. So I think had a really incredible example early on in my career of what could take shape within a
Mhm.
collaborative effort. And that has definitely driven the work and my process and what I'm attracted to across this piece of this across my lifespan and the work that I'm doing. I think, as Shannon shared, like it's those lessons you take from it and the evolution of that I think is really important to kind of consider through this. And so, as from an organizational perspective, the relationships have always been key, but now thinking about, like really getting very specific with some of those relationships is sort of the evolution of that. And I think you get a better sense of also of like what you can and can't sort of take on. I think in your youth, I was like, I'm doing it all. But now that you're recognizing like I don't have the capacity for that, I can be a much better advocate, or I can steer this organization in a better way if I'm focused and thoughtful with it in a bit of a different way. That does mean saying no to certain things that I never thought I would say no to. So, youth mental health, as an example of that, it was something that I am such a staunch believer in supporting youth mental health initiatives in BC. But the capacity of my organization and what I can do, and it's a bit out of scope for us. So I can't be in on those tables in the same way that I would have liked to.
Mhm.
So I think that's just the sort of the evolution of the thinking more than like changing it.
Yeah. Thank you. Shannon?
Yeah, I would say on my side, I mean, I've chosen to work in a coalition. I've been in my role for about 7 years, and had done a lot of work with different actors before, seeing kind of positive policy changes when I was a researcher in my previous life. And so on that side, working with civil society. I think maybe just a reflection, I would say, and I don't know, again, it's more of an evolution too. It's not really a change, but is around your positionality as an organization and understanding how you fit within the ecosystem. So for example, um, within the Imagine Canada space of this fair funding working group, I am from a coalition and I do have more capacity to engage in these items than an organization who's really interested but actually is delivering service, right? Like my role is a certain role. So I feel really deeply about leveraging the influence or possibilities that the role of my organization has, and then showing up at the tables where they actually need people that have some capacity to do those things. But at the same time, being really, really mindful. It's kind of what you said earlier, Amy, about like whose voice are we talking about here, right? So I represent Cooperation Canada. I don't work in partner countries. I don't work in global majority countries. Our partners do, and their partners do. So always being
Mhm.
mindful of like where you are the lead, where you're the ally, where you're the backbone, and like kind of negotiating all of those things, I think is really important.
That's great. Thank you both for your perspectives. I'm wondering, Kavita, how should we go about this?
Yeah, there's only a few questions, some comments.
Mhm.
The first one is actually for you, Ebony. So you'd
Yeah.
mentioned, the need for a provincial government champion. So do we have any ministry staff in Ontario wanting to work on reforms? If we don't, how might we generate that interest and leadership from government staff? Really easy question there, Rob.
Yeah, I saw that was from Rob. Thanks, Rob. I think the previous work we did was with the Treasury Board. I think that's where I would want to start. I think we've just had general difficulties, to be quite honest with you, with getting interest, right? It's just I don't think it's a huge priority. I think we could go, like you said, we could talk to the staff. We could start trying to build out those relationships for the future, like we talked about previously. I think I believe at the federal level, there was some, Imagine, I believe, met with some people in the Treasury Board up there, and they were building out some training, or they were talking about some training that was happening. And I would love to replicate that with our Treasury Board. It's just waiting for the opportunity. But I think that's where it would probably have to sit and take place. I think definitely the staff in there would be where I would want to start for sure. Yeah.
Have we learned anything from COVID? So obviously COVID showed us that governments could move quickly and fund, communities and organizations differently when needed. So what ways can COVID inform how we think about funding reform today? And are there new opportunities from that time that we haven't fully built on?
hmm Well, I can start, but I would love to hear from both of you too. Flexibility was huge. That's come up so much for us around COVID. It just seemed like because of the crisis, the government just had to suddenly say, okay, we trust you and we're going to give you this flexibility. And everyone I spoke to said it was so much easier to pivot and to better serve people because we were not only able to move more efficiently, we were working with people a government funder who trusted us. And so, I think it's really important to stress to the government that it worked. And I can't remember if I mentioned this, but we have a lot of organizations that we talk to that have been receiving government money for decades. And why can't they get at least some flexibility? They've proven track records, right? And another thing we heard was that if one nonprofit makes a mistake, everyone seems to be punished for it. And so it's like if there's a rollback of that flexibility, despite more evidence that it works, right? That it's actually beneficial. So I think it's continued push on our end to say, flexibility worked. We worked during crisis. We're still in a crisis, or we're now in a worse crisis with a new recession. So why don't we bring that back? Why don't we start having those conversations? Because people are in need. But yeah, Amy or Shannon?
Well, I
I
think,
mean,
sorry, go
oh, go
ahead,
ahead.
Shannon, please. You please go.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, some of the things that we did have in COVID actually did translate
Mhm.
into some more permanent changes. So I think, yeah, I think that still goes back to your point about champions and about
Mhm.
kind of having those existing relationships and then being able to say, okay, well, the crisis is over now. What can we keep? What can we work on collectively? And then the evidence piece too, right? So you had more flexibility. Sure, there might be one organization that didn't meet the requirements, but what does the evidence show us of the impact and the result during that crisis period with the more? And I mean, frankly, there's a lot of evidence around the lack of both, I assume also provincial, but federal level effectiveness in transfers to the not-for-profit sector. I think one of the things we've run up against is that evidence doesn't actually fully matter. Like it matters, but it doesn't. So there's been tons of Senate committee reports around the problems of funding the nonprofit sector and not necessarily movement. So you're kind of this like double-edged sword where like you need the evidence, but it might not be the thing that actually moves the needle. But I would say that like from a COVID perspective, I think being able to say like, look, this is what we achieved. This is the impact we had, even with that flexibility. I do think that's an important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. There are pieces of that that are still living and breathing in British Columbia that are results of, the COVID flexibility. I think what we've seen, and again, this goes to context, like political context, is In BC, NDP government, pro social services, pro community fabric. But they seem to have now we're dealing with budget and a deficit that's ballooning. So I think it's the evolution of that we need to be really thoughtful about. So one example for our evolution is we're talking a bit more as an economic case, not so much like the flexibility piece, not so much the specifics that came in, but talking about the specifics in an economic or like financial language to help kind of connect the dots. So it's a bit of an evolution of the COVID pieces into the current day realities and context.
Yeah, just to round that out, I think we've seen a lot more, at least in our work, movement around non-governmental funders with them holding on to what they did during COVID and being really diligent about, that flexibility worked. Let's keep trying it. I think there's going to be a lot more convincing on the government end than with other funders. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, we have 1 minute left. No? Oh, well, thank you. Thank you both first for joining me, but thank you all for coming to this webinar. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope that you're feeling inspired and heard, and that you're ready to maybe join us in this coalition work and at least become involved and see the work that we're putting out there. And I hope to hear from you guys soon, and thank you so much.
And just a reminder, we will send all the links that I bombarded you with in this chat. They will be in the follow-up email. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Nice to